Welcome to our line opinion panels for the week. We're happy to be joined in studio by Paula Garcia. She's the executive director of the New Mexico Acequia Association. Across the table, John Fleck, a professor at the University of New Mexico, who's also a water researcher at the university's Utton Center. And across the table from him, freelance reporter Elizabeth Miller is with us as well. Now we begin with a look back to spring 2022. That's when the Cerro Pelado fire burned up nearly 45,000 acres in the Jemez Mountains. Now we've learned the U.S. Forest Service caused that fire through their management techniques. The fire burned for nearly 2 months, as you might recall, destroying 10 structures and forcing people nearby to evacuate. Now, the Forest Service says a holdover fire from a prescribed burn 2 weeks prior ignited brush in the forest, sparking the fire. Now, although we've known about the prescribed burn for well over a year, the Forest Service didn't confirm the connection between those two until last month. Let's start with why we're here just now hearing this, John, that this prescribed burn caused the Cerro Pelado fire. Is there a legitimate reason, John, for the U.S. Forest Service to be so tight-lipped about its work and the causes of its work? From your sense of it, why do they do this? Why does it take so long to get info from them?
So the short answer is no. One of the things that we have seen, and I had a career as a journalist before I entered academia and saw this over the time that I worked in newspapers, an increasing unwillingness by government agencies, especially the federal government, to be interactive and forthcoming with information about controversial subjects. So was a time when I would call the Forest Service, for example, and the director of the forest would get on the phone with me, right? And you could have those kind of conversations. Increasingly, for a variety of reasons, but information control is one of the most important ones, that's not happening, and I think that's really problematic in this particular case, given the community impacts and the importance of our ability in dealing with the problem of our forest management to work together across the boundaries of government agencies. The top of that pyramid is the federal government.
Interesting points there. Elizabeth, welcome to the table, first of all, first time here. I'm curious, this was the third fire started by the U.S. Forest Service last year, all of them being the direct result of prescribed fires. How necessary are these prescribed fires? We always ask this question for forest management and everything else. We hear a lot of things about ground cover. We've had a lot of things come up, and we're not terribly thinned statewide. Are our hands tied here? Do we have to do this at this point?
I think the role of prescribed fire ecologically is it's hugely important. We did 110 years of wildfire suppression. The rule was to get every smoke out by 10 a.m. the next day. And the result of that is that we do have a lot of dense stands of trees, sometimes even different species of trees spreading into the north slopes of forests. It's really affected forest composition and forest structure. And fire is a wonderful way for the ecosystem to reset itself. It thins out the brush. It allows for different species to move in. It can do all of these wonderful things. We also have a really difficult time with fire in an ecosystem where we've built up into the forest. There are more and more people building in what's called the wildland-urban interface, so there are homes encroaching in areas right up against some of these very dense stands of forest. And so finding this balance of bringing fire back for all of the necessary ecological purposes that it serves and not putting structures and homes at risk is a really tricky place. But I think the scary takeaway could be from these string of terrible incidents that we need to stop prescribed fire, and that could further compound some of these issues.
Sure. Elizabeth, also I want you to get in on what John spoke about as well. You're a water researcher. You did a big series this past spring. We'll talk about here in a little bit about water. In your sense of it, why is the Forest Service so secretive about this? And the reason I ask that, it seems it would be impossible to get to policy decisions you're describing without being timely about why certain things happen. Am I correct on that connection?
I think it's a real conundrum for the Forest Service. They have a directive to use the best available science, and pairing science that's evolving as quickly, particularly around climate change right now, as we're seeing, and the conditions change. Like the problem with the Hermit's Peak Calf Canyon fire, which also started with this prescribed burn, is that it was an outdated burn plan, and it was a plan that didn't adjust according to
Right.
weather changing the day of.
Right.
And so where the Forest Service, I think, is stalling out now is in connecting the dots between following some of the changes in policy that came down after last year's 90-day ban on prescribed burns. Then that was a nationwide measure to try to make sure that the Forest Service wasn't starting these kinds of problems. And the changes that have been implemented internally, the changes that have rippled out of major infrastructure bills that passed on a federal level last year, that's allowed for, from what I hear, more staffing, more community outreach. And yet I'm not seeing quite as much transparency around that and not as much attention to rebuilding the faith from the communities as is needed.
Good point there. Glad you got that in. That's an important point. Paula, thank you for coming in today as well. Appreciate the work you do with the Acequia Association. I do have a question for you on this idea of climate change, how much it might be contributing to this problem. It's an interesting quote in the Santa Fe New Mexican from Randy Moore, someone John knows well, the Forest Service chief here in the state, of course, that these kind of fires, holdover fires, are, quote, a recent phenomenon caused by prolonged droughts associated with climate change. Does that absolve the Forest Service a little bit here, or should they have been a little quicker in understanding, yeah, we're in the middle of climate change, maybe you need to make some changes as well? I'm interested in your thoughts on where he's coming from on that.
Sure. Let's put this into context. The Cerro Grande fire was also started by a prescribed burn. So that was 20 years ago.
Thank you.
So if indeed the Forest Service was keeping up with all of the changing conditions related to climate change, those new protocols should have been in place by now. So I do think there was an institutional failure. I don't think it absolves the Forest Service to say, well, it's climate change, because we've known about climate change for decades. So those fires preceded Hermit's Peak, the Cerro Pelado burn pile, which was a holdover. Though there was enough procedures in place to ensure that the fires wouldn't get out of hand. So I think that there was perhaps some human error, but it was more importantly, I think it was institutional error, because they're not keeping up with the pace of climate change. The moisture content of the trees is very low.
Right.
The soil moisture is very low, and we're dealing with higher temperatures. So there's all these factors that contribute to fires getting out of control. And I think there's a lot of information in the investigation reports about mistakes that were made. And are we going to learn from those mistakes? That's a good question. You know, I don't want to be in the next community where there's an escaped prescribed burn.
Right.
And there's going to have to be a lot of change in the Forest Service to regain the trust of the communities that they serve, the forest-dependent communities, the land-based people. These fires affected some very, from a perspective of land-based people. You're looking at pueblos that have. There's tribal lands that were impacted by Cerro Pelado. There's downstream traditional rural communities that were impacted.
That's right.
And regaining the trust of those communities is going to take some dramatic change. They're not tweaks to manuals. It's an overall management approach. And I think they need to listen better. I think they need to adapt more to climate change and integrate those lessons learned. Because if it takes a whole year to figure out what went wrong, then the pace of institutional change is going to be too slow to keep up with the demands. And we don't get, being from a forest community, we don't get a lot of comfort hearing that, we have some better rules now. And like,
That's right.
It's going to take some a lot of concerted effort to make that happen.
I can see that for sure. Speaking about slowness, John, we're talking about making people whole here. Congress approved nearly $4 billion to compensate victims of the Hermit's Peak Calf Canyon wildfire, as we know. Are victims of the Cerro Pelado fire entitled to federal money, or is the current slow drip of FEMA, as we know, as for funds for survivors? What's going on here? How are people being made whole here, and can they be actually?
It's clear that we have an obligation as a broad community to those communities like Paula's that were so dramatically damaged by these fires. It is clear that the system that we have set up to do that is failing us. And we have to do better, but it's a hard problem. like figuring out how to help rebuild communities is a non-trivial problem. So if I had the answer, or if the answers were easy,
Right.
it would be done, right?
That's right.
But it's important, because a lot of the folks watching this program, folks living in urban areas, who are thinking, this is not my problem. But in fact, what we have is a broad shared responsibility, because the water supply, for example, that Albuquerque and Santa Fe gets flows through forests, and flows through forests that are a mix of private land and state land and federal land, and programs like the Rio Grande Water Fund, where we're trying to bring together many of the people who are the beneficiaries of what this forest offers, not just leaving this as a problem of the federal government and the folks who live there, but New Mexico as a whole is dependent broadly on these forests, and understanding that solving this problem, dealing with the changes we need to make in the forest is sort of a shared responsibility.
Yeah. Elizabeth, where does the state step in? I get this question a lot. We talk so much about the Forest Service, the federal government, all that kind of thing. Are we doing as much as we could be possibly from a state point of view, in your view?
As much as we could be possibly is a really difficult question to speak to, but I think one of the interesting things I've noted in the after effects of the last year is that the state came forward with a policy of saying you do not start a prescribed fire on something the National Weather Service has declared as a red flag warning day, which is to say that the conditions are dry, the wind is up, fire could spread easily, and that was the situation with the Hermit's Peak fire. Of those two fires, was that it started with on a red flag day, and anyone I spoke to in the course of reporting on that fire said as a land user, as a land owner, I would never have lit a fire on my land that day. I don't know why the federal government would have. So that the federal government has been willing to hear that statement and that policy from the state and adopt it, even though policy doesn't usually run upstream like that. I mean, I think that's a sign of New Mexico's ability to take a stand on some of these issues and get some responsiveness from the federal government, and that's at least one thing that they've achieved.
Good points there. Thanks to our line opinion panel. We'll meet back here at the table in about 15 minutes to talk about how our state uses its limited amount of fresh water and why some groups are calling for a change.